After watching The Game of Thrones and House of Dragons, you now are inspired to write fantasy romance. But how do you do it? Where do you begin? How should you start? Well, according to How to Write a Romance and Get It Published, this is what they have to say about romance in science fiction and fantasy. Is there room for a free spirit with literary leanings in the world of romance fiction? Can an author who writes historical romance or contemporary romance find a niche for writing romance in the science fiction and fantasy field? The answer to the above is yes, and very nicely, thank you. It goes without saying that a writer who wants to combine the genres must be well read in both. The queen of sci-fi romance, Anne McCaffrey, nourished herself by reading authors such as Andre Norton, Edmund Hamilton, Avron Davison, Damon Knight, Frederick Poole, Lehigh Brackett, and Zaina Henderson. Once you have checked out these authors, you're going to rush down to your local library where you'll check out The American Gods by Neil Gaiman and the 5 completed series by George R.R. Martin, which include A Game of Thrones, A Clash of Kings, A Storm of Swords, A Feast of Crows, and A Dance with Dragons. And you will be anticipating the final 2 books in this series, which are called The Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring. So, once you have done your reading, you are now ready. You are now convinced that you can write a fantasy romance. But what's the next step? What do you do after you've done all your research? Well, according to How to Write a Romance and Get It Published by Catherine Falk, it says, Anne McCaffrey is an accomplished romantic novelist, having written Gothics, and is now an even more accomplished science fiction writer. It was when she combined the 2 genres, Gothic and science fiction, that she caught a larger reading public than most science fiction writers ever experienced. What is her advice for new writers? I can only describe what I do. I'm a storyteller, and I'm telling the story to myself as much as to the reader. So I generally start from a situation, a conflict between personalities, or between people and their society, or a society that I create in science fiction. That's a good way to emphasize a modern day problem. Remove it by a couple of centuries and cultures. And then take another look. I've noticed that if a situation is valid in terms of human interactions, the plot will grow from the conflict. Some books have written themselves. Others have taken a lot of work. For instance, I had written 370 pages of the second version of Dragon Quest and could not get the book to write itself further. Betty Ballantine, my editor, suggested that I come up to her place for the weekend and we would do the book together. Examining the scenes, word by word, can be a rather harrowing experience, even for an experienced author. Betty zeroed in on the problem. I was telling the story from the wrong character viewpoint. The moment she suggested that Dragon Quest was Fëanor's story rather than Flar's and Les's story, the rest of the novel slotted into focus. Another science fiction influenced author, Karen Juneman, who writes as Flame Devlin, gave readers one of the first UFO romances in a nice little book, Alien Encounters, 1981. The man and the woman fall in love during a UFO incident in their town. The Writer's Digest gives 4 tips for writing fantasy romance. 1. Create your world first, then focus on the romance later. Any book in any genre requires a lot of world building, but a fantasy or science fiction book takes a little extra effort. The science fiction author Jennifer Eastep advises on her online article with Writer's Digest, in the beginning of your story, focus on building your fantasy world. What kind of magic does your heroine have? How does her powers work? What are her goals? Who are her allies? Who are her enemies? For me, the romance will often flow out of answering these sorts of questions. Her next tip is, know how many books you're writing. Think about how many books or stories you want to write in your fantasy world. Is it a standalone, a trilogy, a longer series? Having a rough idea of how many books you want to write in a certain world can help you plot out your overall fantasy arc, like saving the kingdom, as well as your romantic arc, like 2 people falling in love. In some ways, writing a standalone fantasy romance can be much harder than writing a series because you need to bring both the fantasy and romance plot to a satisfying conclusion in just one book. So just keep in mind how long you want your story to be and try to plot out your fantasy and romantic arcs accordingly. The next thing to consider when writing your fantasy is tropes. Both the fantasy and romance genres are well known for their tropes, like the chosen one with the great destiny, fantasy, or enemies to lovers, romance. Tropes can be a useful starting point for determining what type of story you want to tell. Do you want your heroines to save her kingdom, or do you want them to seek revenge? How about finding a long-lost treasure? Do you want your heroines to have a slow burn romance? Be put into a marriage of convenience? Pretend to have a romantic relationship with someone else? Thinking about the type of story that you want to tell can be another good way to help balance out the fantasy and romance plot in your books. And fourth and finally, similar goals and different squads. This is the last tip that Jennifer Eastep has to offer. You don't want your hero to fall in love with someone who has nothing to do with the fantasy plot of your book. Otherwise, your story runs the risk of feeling disjointed. So how do you tie the fantasy and romance plots together? One way to do that is for your characters to have similar goals, but for varying different reasons. Your hero and heroine can want to save the kingdom, but for different reasons. It is up to you as the author to figure out what those reasons are and to design your story accordingly, and to take your time in world building and in developing the storylines or the multiple storylines. And also keep this in mind. You do not have to complete everything in a day, in a week, in a month. You can take your time and enjoy creating your new world.